The evening air in Vermont carried a soft chill when Margaret Turner stood by her kitchen window, watching the quiet road that led to her house. It was one of those nights that felt too still, too delicate, like the world was holding its breath. She usually enjoyed peaceful evenings, especially since her daughter Emily had moved to Seattle 3 weeks earlier for her new job. But tonight there was a strange heaviness in the air. Something she couldn't quite name. The house wasn't lonely. Margaret had learned to live with silence, but the absence of her daughter's cheerful voice still echoed in small ways. The only person around now was her son-in-law, Daniel, who was temporarily living with her until he completed a project at his firm. He was polite, organized, and careful with everything he did. Almost too careful, she sometimes thought. But tonight, he was different. She could sense it from the moment he arrived home. What first caught her attention was the sound of his footsteps outside. They were sharper and faster than usual. When she leaned close to the open window, she noticed him pacing near his car, phone pressed tightly to his ear. The porch light fell across his face, revealing tension she rarely saw. His brows were pulled together, his jaw tight, and his shoulders stiff as if he was preparing himself for something important. Margaret didn't mean to listen in, but the quiet of the night made every sound clearer. "Yeah. Tonight?" he said, his voice low. "No, don't tell her. I just need to figure this out first." Her fingers curled around the countertop. She couldn't tell if he meant Emily or herself, and not knowing bothered her more than she expected. Daniel always carried himself with honesty and openness. He was the last person she ever imagined keeping secrets. She stepped back from the window quickly, almost guilty for hearing anything. But worry crept into her mind like a shadow slipping under a door. Over the last few days, Daniel had seemed tired, distracted, even a little lost. He often stared at his laptop late into the night, whispering in hushed tones when someone called him. She thought perhaps it was his job or stress from Emily moving away before him. But now she wasn't so sure by the time he entered the kitchen. Margaret had tried to place a calm expression on her face, though her heart was still tugging with questions. "Oh, Margaret," he said, startled. "I thought you'd already gone to bed." "No," she replied softly. "Just couldn't sleep." He nodded and placed his keys on the table, but the motion seemed heavy, almost strained. His eyes looked tired, as if he'd been wrestling with thoughts far too big to contain. She didn't like seeing him this way. He was family, and even though he wasn't her own son, she cared about him more than she admitted to him or to herself. "Everything all right?" she asked gently. He hesitated. It wasn't a long pause, but it was enough to show that he was choosing his words carefully. "Just plans tonight," he said. "My friends and I are working on something important. I didn't want to worry you," was a vague answer. Too vague for someone like Daniel, who usually spoke with clarity. "Plans?" she repeated, not pushing, but unable to hide her concern. He looked at her then, really looked at her. It wasn't romantic or out of place. It was simply a moment where one human being silently asked another for understanding. He had that expression of someone carrying too much and trying too hard to hide it. She had seen that look before many years ago, in the mirror during tough times in her own life, before either of them could say anything more. A car horn sounded sharply outside. Daniel flinched slightly, straightening in a way that told her he'd been anxiously waiting for it. "They're here," he said quickly. He grabbed his jacket and headed toward the door. But halfway through, he turned back to her. His face softened, but there was still a hint of something hidden beneath it, fear, maybe, or guilt, or the weight of an unspoken truth. "If I come back late, please don't wait up." She nodded, forcing a small smile. "All right. Be safe." When the door closed behind him, it echoed through the quiet house, louder than usual. The headlights of the car flashed against the walls for a moment, and then the night returned to silence. Margaret stood there for a long time, unsure why her heart felt uneasy. Daniel wasn't a reckless man. He wasn't careless, but there was something in his voice earlier, something she had never heard before. She tried to tell herself he was simply stressed from work, that he was tired from being between two homes and two lives. that he was allowed to have private conversations and plans with friends. But none of those explanations eased her mind. What bothered her most was the gentle fear she had seen in his eyes. Not fear for himself, but fear of letting someone down. She walked into the living room and sat on the couch, pulling a warm blanket over her lap. The house felt larger tonight, the silence deeper. She had lived alone for years before Emily married. But this emptiness felt different, like something unsaid was lingering in the air. She turned on a lamp, but even the light didn't help. It only highlighted how distracted she felt. Her thoughts kept returning to the way. Daniel's voice had softened when she asked if he was all right. The way he avoided explaining the important plans. The way his shoulders seemed to carry more weight than a man his age should have to bear. It wasn't romantic longing she felt. It was human concern mixed with the quiet ache of someone who had spent too many nights carrying her own unspoken burdens. Seeing the same heaviness in someone else, especially in someone she cared about, stirred old emotions. An hour passed, then another. Margaret tried to read. She tried to make tea. She tried to rest her eyes, but nothing worked. Her mind kept circling back to Daniel's expression before he left. The soft worry in his eyes. The strange vulnerability he carried. Finally, she gave up and went back to the kitchen window, staring out into the empty driveway. The moonlight reflected against the pavement, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Why did he look so troubled? Why did he hide it? What were these plans he didn't want her to know about? Questions turned into more questions, and the night grew heavier with every passing minute. Yet underneath her worry, something else tugged at her heart, a quiet, unexpected emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't romantic, but it wasn't just maternal either. It was a kind of deep, instinctive protectiveness she hadn't felt in years. Daniel wasn't a child, wasn't vulnerable in the way her daughter once was. But tonight, he felt fragile in a different sense, man lost in his own responsibilities, trying to stay strong, and she couldn't shake the memory of the way he looked at her. Before leaving, as if he wished he could explain more but didn't know how. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She waited, even though he asked her not to. She wasn't waiting out of suspicion or fear. She was waiting because something in her heart refused to rest until he came home. And as the hours stretched into midnight, only one thought remained in her mind. Tonight felt like the beginning of something neither of them understood yet. The house was quiet, almost painfully so, after Daniel left. Margaret had tried to sleep, but her mind kept replaying his expressions, the way he hesitated, the tension in his voice. Hours passed slowly, and every small sound, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside, made her heart jump. She didn't realize how deeply she had been holding her breath until she heard the soft click of the front door. Daniel had returned. Margaret rose quietly, smoothing her nightgown, and moved toward the hallway. There he stood, silhouetted by the faint glow from the porch light, jacket slightly wrinkled, shoes dusted from the evening air. He looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen him, but also relieved. As if returning home was a small victory. "You're still awake?" he asked, surprised, though a small smile tried to break through his exhaustion. "Yes," said softly, keeping her voice calm. "I couldn't sleep." Daniel exhaled slowly and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He leaned for a moment against the wall, as if gathering courage, and then walked toward the living room. Margaret followed quietly, keeping a respectful distance, but refusing to let the moment pass without acknowledgement, sitting on the edge of the couch. Daniel seemed smaller somehow, worn down by something heavier than physical fatigue. Margaret settled beside him, careful not to crowd him, but close enough to offer comfort. The silence between them was filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Daniel spoke. His voice was low, quiet, almost fragile. "It wasn't a party. It wasn't really a plan with friends, not the way it sounded." Margaret tilted her head slightly, encouraging him to continue. She didn't interrupt. She didn't push. She only offered him the quiet space to speak. I didn't want Emily to know," he admitted. "I had to figure things out myself first." His hands fidgeted in his lap. "I lost a promotion. I thought I'd have more time before moving to Seattle. I didn't want to disappoint her tonight. Tonight, my friends were helping me figure out my next steps. It was supposed to be private. I didn't want anyone to worry. Margaret listened carefully, her heart tightening. She understood now. The tension, the secretive conversation, the flinching at the car horn, it wasn't about fun or reckless plans. It was about responsibility, fear of failure, and the weight of expectations. You didn't have to carry all of this alone, she said gently, placing a hand lightly on his arm. It was a motherly gesture, but there was also warmth, kindness, and genuine understanding. Daniel looked at her, and for the first time that night, the tension in his shoulders softened. I know, He paused, unsure how to put into words what he felt. I didn't want anyone to see me fail. Margaret's heart ached. She could feel the honesty in his words. The vulnerability he didn't show anyone else. And it reminded her of her own struggles in years past. Life often asked more than anyone could handle. And Daniel was no exception. You're stronger than you think, she said softly. And stronger doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means knowing when to let someone in. Let me in, Daniel. We care about you. He took a deep breath, looking at her with eyes that reflected both relief and something softer, something human and real. He wasn't seeking sympathy or advice. He simply needed to be seen, to be heard, without judgment. Margaret offered that quietly, without overstepping boundaries. For a long moment, they just sat there. No words, just the shared silence of two people connecting over the weight of life's challenges. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't inappropriate. It was profound in its simplicity, human bond formed in understanding. In compassion, in empathy, Daniel finally spoke again. Thank you for staying up, for asking, for caring. His voice was low, but the gratitude in it was deep and real. Your family, Margaret replied. You never have to face things alone. The small smile that appeared on Daniel's face carried a mixture of relief, hope, and exhaustion. Margaret could see the invisible load he had been carrying lift slightly, replaced by a sense of safety and acceptance. The night no longer felt heavy. The tension had eased as they sat together. The conversation drifted naturally, touching on lighter topics, memories of Emily as a child, shared meals they had enjoyed, and funny stories from Daniel's work. Margaret noticed a small shift in his demeanor. He laughed quietly, genuinely, the way he hadn't all evening. She felt a sense of peace that was rare in her quiet home. Yet underneath the comfort, a quiet tension lingered, not the previous anxiety, but the subtle awareness that this night had changed something. Not between them, but within them. The night had peeled back layers of pretense, revealing the real struggles. The human vulnerability that often remained hidden. Daniel finally stood, stretching slightly, his energy returning. I should get some rest, he said, though there was a softness in his voice now that hadn't been there before. Margaret nodded. Good night, and remember, tomorrow is a new day. Whatever happens, you'll find a way. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment she saw gratitude and a quiet connection that transcended words. I will, he said, and then left for the guest room. Closing the door behind him with a lighter step than before, Margaret returned to her own room, her mind spinning with the events of the evening. It was strange, she realized, how a single night could reveal so much, how simple honesty could lift burdens, how a conversation could change the weight of worry into relief. She felt a deep appreciation for the man sitting in the next room, because he had revealed secrets, but because he had trusted her, even in a small way. With the truth, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, reflecting on human connections. Life often forced people to hide their struggles to protect those they loved from disappointment or pain. But tonight had reminded her that letting someone in even just a little could create a bond far stronger than fear or pride. Margaret thought about Emily, far away in Seattle. She imagined her daughter hearing about this night and realizing how much support Daniel had here. How much love surrounded him even when he felt alone. The thought brought a small smile to Margaret's face. Families weren't just about living under the same roof. They were about understanding, compassion, and shared strength, even across distances. The night was quiet again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full with understanding, with trust, with a kind of human connection that lingered long after words were spoken. Margaret knew that things would move forward differently now. Daniel would continue his journey, Emily would continue hers, and she would continue to be the quiet, steady presence in both their lives, offering support when it mattered most. And somewhere deep in her heart, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that even when life seemed heavy, even when plans failed or expectations shifted, people could find strength in honesty, comfort in connection, and peace in simply being seen. The clock ticked past midnight. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak of settling wood. Margaret closed her eyes, finally able to breathe fully, knowing that the night, which had begun with worry and tension, had ended with calm understanding, and a quiet promise that life, no matter how unpredictable, was still filled with moments worth holding on to. And though the night had passed, both Margaret and Daniel would carry its lessons forward: the value of honesty, the power of empathy, and the gentle strength of human connection. It was a night neither of them would forget. A night that quietly changed the way they saw each other and themselves. As the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, the house felt warmer, lighter, and more alive. Margaret stayed awake a little longer, reflecting on the simplicity of what had happened. Sometimes, she thought, the most powerful moments weren't loud or dramatic. They were quiet, human, and deeply real. And tonight had been exactly that. The night had begun with secrets and worry, but it ended with understanding, tenderness, and the kind of quiet hope that stayed with you long after the darkness passed. And Margaret knew, without a doubt, that life was capable of giving unexpected moments of clarity, connection, and comfort, sometimes in a single night, sometimes in a single conversation. Tonight had been one of those nights,